Sometimes the most broken hearts are the ones most capable of healing. When a man has lost everything he holds dear, even the smallest act of mercy can change his entire world. In the harsh winter of 1883, Eli Thatcher was just another drifting cowboy with nothing left to lose. He'd buried his wife and child years before, and each day since had been about surviving until the next. But when he discovered two starving donkeys abandoned behind a collapsed mining post in Wyoming Territory, everything changed. These weren't just any animals, they were dying, forgotten, and completely dependent on his mercy. Eli had come to put them out of their misery. Instead, when they pressed their trembling heads into his weathered hands, something inside him broke open. For the first time in years, he felt needed. As winter closed in around them, Eli found himself fighting not just to save these creatures, but to reclaim his own lost humanity. But when a ruthless landowner arrives, claiming the donkeys as his property, Eli must decide what he's truly willing to fight for. What happens when a man who's given up on life suddenly finds something worth saving? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eli Thatcher had once been a different man. In the pocket of his worn leather vest, wrapped carefully in a piece of oiled cloth, lay a simple gold wedding ring, all that remained of the life he'd built and lost. Sarah's ring. Even now, 3 years after he'd slipped it from her cold finger, he carried it everywhere, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly around him as his horse, Old Blue, picked his way through the rocky terrain. November had turned bitter, and the sky hung low and grey, promising snow before nightfall. Eli pulled his coat tighter against the wind that cut through the high country like a blade. At 42, he looked older, his brown hair streaked with premature silver, deep lines carved around his eyes by grief and weather. His hands, once steady enough to thread a needle or comfort a crying child, now shook most mornings until the whiskey steadied them. He hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Eli Thatcher had been a man of substance, owner of a modest ranch outside Cheyenne, husband to the prettiest schoolteacher in 3 counties, father to a boy with Sarah's green eyes and his own stubborn chin. Thomas had been 7 when the diphtheria took him, just old enough to help with the morning chores and young enough to still climb into his father's lap for bedtime stories. The outbreak had come swift and merciless in the spring of 1880. Eli had been away on a cattle drive 2 weeks, pushing a small herd to market in Colorado. By the time he'd returned, flush with pride over the good price he'd fetched for their beef, Sarah was already sick. Thomas had been dead for 3 days, buried in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, where Eli and Sarah had exchanged vows. I tried to wait, Sarah had whispered from their bed, her face pale as winter moonlight. I tried to hold on until you came home. She'd lasted another week, long enough for Eli to sit beside her, to hold her burning hand, to listen as she forgave him for being away when their world fell apart. Long enough for him to make promises about carrying on, about keeping their memory alive, about being the man she'd married. He'd kept none of them. The ranch had gone to creditors within a year. Eli had drunk away what little remained, gambled away the rest. For 3 years now, he'd drifted from job to job, a month here breaking horses, a season there riding fence for some cattleman who needed an extra hand and didn't ask too many questions about a man's past. Old Blue was the last piece of his former life, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes who seemed to understand that his master was a man diminished. Today they'd been riding since dawn, following a narrow trail that wound through the foothills toward an old mining camp called Broken Creek. Eli had heard there might be work there, a mining operation, looking for men to guard their equipment through the winter. It was the kind of job that appealed to him now, isolated, temporary, requiring little human contact. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, wood smoke, faint but distinct. Eli straightened in his saddle, scanning the landscape ahead. Through the scattered pine trees, he could make out the dark outline of buildings, Broken Creek, or what remained of it. As they crested a small ridge, the mining camp spread out below them like the bones of some long-dead creature. Most of the buildings had collapsed under the weight of neglect and mountain winters. A few structures still stood: a main office building with half its roof caved in, a bunkhouse with broken windows gaping like empty eye sockets, and scattered throughout the camp, the weathered remains of sluices and mining equipment. Old Blue snorted and shook his head, ears pricked forward. The horse had better instincts than most people, Eli knew, and right now those instincts were telling him something was wrong. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, but he felt it too, a wrongness in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. They picked their way down the slope, past rusted machinery and piles of tailings that would never yield another ounce of gold. The camp felt like a graveyard, and Eli found himself holding his breath as they moved between the silent buildings. He'd seen plenty of abandoned places in his wandering, but this one felt different, haunted maybe, by dreams that had died hard. It was Old Blue who heard them first. The horse stopped so suddenly that Eli nearly slid from the saddle, head raised, ears swiveling toward a sound too faint for human hearing. Then Eli caught it, a low, pitiful sound that might have been wind through broken timber, but wasn't. The sound was coming from behind the main office building. Eli dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively checking the weight of the Colt at his hip. He'd carried the gun for 3 years without drawing it in anger, but old habits died hard in country where trouble could come from any direction. He moved carefully around the building, Old Blue following with reluctant steps. Behind the office stood a smaller structure, probably a storage shed in the camp's working days. The roof had partially collapsed, and one wall leaned at a dangerous angle. But it was what lay in the shadow of that wall that stopped Eli in his tracks. 2 donkeys, both lying on their sides in the dirt. They were so thin that every rib showed through their dull coats, their hip bones jutting out like knife blades. One, slightly larger than the other, lifted its head at Eli's approach. Its dark eyes were enormous in a face that spoke of suffering beyond words. The smaller donkey didn't move at all. Eli stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. These weren't wild animals. The remnants of worn halters around their necks told him they'd been domesticated, cared for, trusted humans. Someone had brought them here and then simply left them to die. The larger donkey made that sound again, a low, mournful cry that seemed to come from the very depths of despair. It was trying to stand, Eli realized, trying to come to him despite its weakness. Without conscious thought, Eli found himself moving forward, dropping to his knees in the dirt beside the animals. The smaller one was breathing, but barely. Its eyes were closed, and when Eli placed his hand on its neck, he could feel how cold it was, despite its winter coat. The larger donkey had managed to get its front legs under itself. It looked at Eli with those dark eyes, and in them he saw something that nearly broke what remained of his heart hope. Despite everything that had been done to it, despite being abandoned and left to starve, this animal still hoped that the human who had appeared might be different. Slowly, carefully, Eli reached out his hand. The donkey didn't pull away. Instead, it stretched its neck forward and pressed its muzzle against Eli's palm. The touch was gentle, trusting, heartbreaking in its simplicity. That was when Eli Thatcher began to cry deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place he'd thought was dead inside him. The tears he'd been unable to shed at Sarah's funeral, at Thomas's graveside, during all the long nights of guilt and self-recrimination, finally came. They fell onto the donkey's face, and still it pressed against his hand, offering comfort even in its own extremity. "I'm sorry," Eli whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to the animals, to his dead family, or to himself. "I'm so sorry." Eli wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and forced himself to stand. The smart thing would be to put these animals out of their misery right now. A bullet for each of them, quick, merciful, final. It was what any reasonable man would do. He drew his Colt, the familiar weight settling into his palm like an old friend. The larger donkey watched him with those trusting eyes, still hoping. The smaller one hadn't moved. Eli raised the gun, aimed at the larger donkey's head. His finger found the trigger, one squeeze, and its suffering would be over. But he couldn't do it. Not with the animal looking at him like that. Not with its muzzle still warm against his palm where it had sought comfort. Instead, he holstered the weapon and walked toward the collapsed office building, needing to understand how this had happened. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges. Eli pushed it open and stepped into the gloom. Broken furniture littered the floor, and the wind whistled through gaps in the walls. But on the desk, protected by an overturned chair, lay a leather-bound ledger book, its pages water-stained but still legible. Eli opened it and began to read. The entries told the story of the Broken Creek Mining Company's final month's debts mounting, ore yields declining, workers leaving for better prospects in Colorado. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, reflecting the desperation of whoever had been trying to keep the operation alive. Then he found the entry that made his blood run cold. October 15th, 1883. Can't afford to feed the donkeys anymore. Left them enough grain for a week. Someone will come through eventually, find them a good home. Better than bringing them to town where they'd just get worked to death. The date was 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks these animals had been waiting for someone to come through, to give them that good home. 6 weeks they'd slowly starved while their owner told himself someone else would solve his problem. Eli slammed the ledger shut, anger rising in his chest like floodwater. He'd seen men abandon animals before it was a harsh country, and not everyone had the strength to make hard choices. But this cowardice, this willful blindness, was something different. This was a man who'd convinced himself that walking away was somehow merciful. He returned to the donkeys, the ledger tucked under his arm. The larger one lifted its head again at his approach, ears pricked forward despite its weakness. The smaller one had opened its eyes, a good sign, maybe. "Well," Eli said aloud, his voice rough from disuse, "looks like your owner was a fool and a coward. Left you here to die because he couldn't bear to do what needed doing." The larger donkey struggled to its feet, swaying but determined. Up close, Eli could see it was a Jenny, probably 4 or 5 years old. Her coat should have been a rich brown, but starvation had turned it dull and brittle. Still, there was spirit in her eyes, a stubbornness that reminded him of Sarah when she'd made up her mind about something. The smaller one was also a Jenny, younger, maybe 3 years old. She was trying to stand now, too, following her companion's lead. They were a bonded pair, Eli realized. They'd been through this ordeal together, probably keeping each other alive through sheer will. Old Blue nickered from where he'd been ground-tied, reminding Eli that snow was coming and they needed shelter. The smart thing would still be to end this quickly. He had his own survival to worry about, and winter in the high country was no place for sentiment. But as he looked at the 2 Jennies, something stirred in his chest, not the crushing weight he'd carried for 3 years, but something lighter. Not hope, exactly, but the memory of what hope felt like. "You girls have names?" he asked, knowing it was foolish to talk to animals that couldn't answer. The larger Jenny took a tentative step toward him, and he made his decision. From his saddlebags, Eli pulled out a leather pouch containing the last of his oats grain he'd been saving for Old Blue. He poured a small amount into his hat and offered it to the larger Jenny. She sniffed cautiously, then began to eat with desperate hunger. Her companion struggled over, and Eli divided the remaining oats between them, making sure each got an equal share. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The snow that had been threatening all day finally began to fall fat, lazy flakes that would soon turn to a serious storm. They needed shelter, all of them. The old bunkhouse was the most intact building in the camp. Eli led Old Blue inside, then returned for the jennies. The larger one followed him readily enough, but the smaller one was barely able to walk. Eli found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He picked up the animal, all 70 pounds of her, and carried her to shelter. Inside the bunkhouse, he made them as comfortable as possible. He found some old blankets in a trunk, moth-eaten but still functional, and wrapped them around the smaller Jenny. The larger one had already made herself at home, investigating every corner of their new shelter. "Grace," Eli said suddenly, looking at the smaller Jenny. "That's what I'll call you. And you." He turned to the larger one. "You'll be Hope." The names felt right somehow. Grace for the smaller one who'd shown such quiet dignity in her suffering. Hope for the larger one who'd never stopped believing someone would come. As the storm intensified outside, Eli found himself doing something else he hadn't done in years, planning for tomorrow. The Jennies needed food, medicine, care. He had maybe 3 days' worth of supplies, enough to get them started on the road to recovery, if he was careful. It meant staying put instead of moving on. It meant taking responsibility for something other than his own survival. It meant caring about whether someone lived or died, and that was dangerous territory for a man who'd learned that caring only led to loss. But as Grace tucked her head against his side and Hope dozed peacefully for the first time in weeks, Eli Thatcher felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, the sense that he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. Outside, the wind howled through the abandoned mining camp, but inside the old bunkhouse, 3 broken souls had found each other. Whether they'd all survive the winter remained to be seen, but for the first time in 3 years, Eli was willing to find out. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world transformed under a blanket of fresh snow. Eli woke to find Grace curled against his side like a large dog, her breathing steady and warm. Hope stood at the broken window, ears alert, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and pink. It had been years since Eli had woken to the sound of animals moving around him, and longer still, since he'd felt needed first thing in the morning. On the ranch, there had always been chores, waiting cattle to check, fences to mend, hay to spread. Sarah would already be up, coffee brewing, planning the day's tasks, while Thomas stumbled sleepy-eyed to the kitchen table. That life felt like something that had happened to someone else. Grace stirred as Eli sat up, her dark eyes focusing on his face with what looked like gratitude. She was still weak, but the grain from yesterday and a night of rest had put some life back into her. Hope wandered over, nuzzling his shoulder with friendly boldness. "Morning, ladies," Eli said, surprised by how natural it felt to talk to them. He'd gotten out of the habit of conversation during his wandering years, speaking only when necessity demanded it. But these two seemed to invite words, their expressive faces turning toward him like flowers following the sun. From his pack, he pulled out a piece of hardtack and broke it into pieces, sharing it between Grace and Hope. It wasn't ideal food for donkeys, but it was what he had. Later, he'd need to scout the area for better forage grass buried under snow, pine needles they could digest, anything to supplement their meager diet. But first, he needed to create proper feeding bowls. The old mining camp was littered with equipment, and somewhere in that rusty graveyard of dreams, he'd find what he needed. Working with his hands felt good, better than he'd expected. Eli found a piece of seasoned pine from a collapsed building and began to carve, his knife moving with remembered skill. He'd learned woodworking from his father, back when such skills seemed like they might be useful for more than just surviving. Thomas had been showing interest in carving too, his small hands eager to copy his father's movements. "Your daddy's hands can make anything," Sarah used to tell the boy, just like his daddy before him and his daddy before that. Now Eli carved 2 simple bowls, nothing fancy but functional and smooth-edged, so they wouldn't hurt the Jennies' mouths. Grace watched the work with interest, occasionally sniffing at the wood shavings. Hope had discovered that if she pushed against Eli with her nose, he would sometimes pause to scratch behind her ears. By midday, he had 2 serviceable feeding bowls and had located a small spring not far from the bunkhouse water that ran clear and cold down from the mountain peaks. The Jennies followed him there, Hope with growing confidence, Grace still a bit unsteady but determined not to be left behind. Watching them drink, Eli felt a strange sense of accomplishment. It had been so long since he'd successfully cared for anything that the simple act of providing clean water felt like a victory. "You know," he said to Hope, as she lifted her dripping muzzle from the spring, "I had a ranch once, had horses, cattle, even a milk cow. Thought I knew everything there was to know about taking care of livestock." Hope regarded him with those intelligent eyes, as if she understood that this was important somehow. "Had a family too," Eli continued, the words coming easier than they had in years. "A wife who could make biscuits that'd make you weep, and a boy who wanted to be a cowboy more than anything in the world. Funny thing about having everything you want, you don't realize how easily it can disappear." Grace had finished drinking and now stood close enough to touch, her presence somehow comforting rather than demanding. Eli reached out and ran his hand along her neck, feeling the prominent ridge of her spine, the way her skin had started to tighten over her ribs as her body began to recover. That afternoon, he explored more of the mining camp, looking for anything useful. In a collapsed supply shed, he found a treasure: 2 sacks of oats, weevily and mouse-chewed, but still mostly good. Enough to feed the Jennies properly for at least a week, if he was careful. The discovery filled him with something he'd almost forgotten: hope for tomorrow. For the first time since Sarah's death, he found himself thinking beyond the immediate needs of survival. The Jennies would need shelter for the winter, better than the drafty bunkhouse. They'd need consistent food, protection from predators, maybe even company of their own kind come spring. All of which meant staying put, establishing roots, becoming the kind of man who planned for the future instead of just running from the past. That evening, as Eli fed the Jennies their oats from the wooden bowls he'd carved, he caught sight of something that made him pause. Tracks in the snow near the edge of camp, horse tracks, fairly fresh. Someone had been watching, staying at a distance but definitely observing. Old Blue snorted and shifted restlessly, his ears pricked toward the tree line. The gelding's instincts were rarely wrong. "What do you think, boy?" Eli murmured. "Friend or trouble?" But even as he wondered about the unknown visitor, Eli realized something had changed. 3 days ago, he would have saddled up and ridden away at the first sign of human interest. The world was full of people with questionable intentions, and a man alone was always vulnerable. Now, though, he wasn't alone. Grace and hope depended on him, and he found that responsibility anchored him in a way he hadn't expected. Whatever those tracks meant, whoever had been watching, Eli Thatcher wasn't running anymore. He spent his first night in the abandoned mining camp, sleeping with one hand on his rifle and the other resting on Grace's warm flank, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the wind. By the 4th day, Grace was strong enough to walk without stumbling, and Hope had begun exploring the mining camp with the confident curiosity of a creature who knew she was safe. Eli found himself talking to them, constantly describing what he was doing as he worked, sharing memories that had been locked away for years, even singing the old songs Sarah used to hum while she worked in their kitchen. It was while searching through the ruins of the camp's general store that Eli found something that stopped him in his tracks. Tucked inside a rotting crate behind the counter, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a small wooden horse barely 3 inches long, carved from the same pine he'd been using for the feeding bowls. He knew this horse. His own hands had shaped it during the long evenings of Thomas's 6th winter, while Sarah sewed by lamplight and their son played at their feet. It was meant to be a Christmas gift, part of a whole set of animals Eli had planned to carve. But Christmas had come early that year in the form of pneumonia, and by New Year's Eve, Thomas was gone. Eli had thrown the horse into his saddlebags the day he left the ranch, unable to look at it, but equally unable to leave it behind. Somehow, over 3 years of wandering, it had migrated to the bottom of his pack, forgotten until now. He stood in the ruined store, holding the little horse up to catch the afternoon light filtering through broken boards. The wood was smooth and warm in his palm, unmarked by time or weather. Thomas would have loved it. Grace wandered into the store, her hooves crunching on broken glass. She investigated the wooden horse with gentle curiosity, sniffing at Eli's hands. "This was for my boy," Eli said softly. "Thought maybe he'd like to play cowboy with it. Funny thing is, I can't remember now if he ever saw it finished." Grace pressed her muzzle against his shoulder, not demanding attention, just offering presence. It was something she'd started doing, this gentle contact when the sadness crept into his voice. "Reckon he would have liked you, girls," Eli continued, slipping the wooden horse into Grace's feed bowl where she could see it. "Always wanted pets, but Sarah was worried about the germs. Said farm animals were different from house pets. Maybe she was right. Maybe if we'd been more careful." The thought trailed off unfinished, as it always did. There was no path down that particular road that didn't lead to madness. That evening, Eli built a small fire in the shelter of the bunkhouse doorway, close enough for warmth, but far enough away to avoid setting the old building ablaze. The Jennies settled nearby, Grace with the wooden horse placed carefully beside her bedding of old blankets. "You know what the hardest part was?" Eli said to Hope, who was drowsing with her chin resting on his knee. "It wasn't the dying. Sounds terrible to say, but the dying was quick. The hard part was afterward, when I had to figure out how to keep living." Hope's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but she didn't raise her head. Everybody had advice. Pastor said it was God's will. Doc said these things happen. Neighbors said I needed to be strong, find a new wife, start over. Like Sarah and Thomas were just replaceable. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the clear night sky. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns that had guided travelers and storytellers since the beginning of time. Truth is, I didn't want to replace them. Still don't. But I'm starting to think maybe there's room for something new alongside the old. Something different. Not better or worse, just different. No. Grace had been listening too, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Now she struggled to her feet and walked over to where Eli sat, lowering herself carefully until she was lying beside him, her warm bulk against his side. "You're good company, ladies," Eli murmured. "Better than most humans I've met lately." The next morning brought visitors. Eli woke to the sound of horses approaching and the nervous shifting of Old Blue in his makeshift stall. Through the broken window, he could see 3 riders picking their way through the ruins of the camp, 2 men and a woman, well-dressed and mounted on good horses. The woman dismounted first, a handsome lady of perhaps 50 years, with graying hair and intelligent eyes. She wore a riding habit of good quality wool and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Thatcher?" she called. "I'm Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison from the town of Cedar Falls. Might we have a word?" Eli stepped outside, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. The Jennies followed him, Hope with typical boldness, Grace keeping close to his side. "Depends on what about," Eli replied. Mrs. Morrison's eyes took in the scene, the makeshift shelter, the feeding bowls, the obvious care being given to animals that had clearly been near death not long ago. "We heard you'd taken in some abandoned stock," she said. "Word travels fast in small communities. I run the dry goods store in Cedar Falls, and my husband," she gestured to one of the men, a portly gentleman with kind eyes, "serves on the town council. We've been concerned about the situation here." "What situation would that be?" "The legal one," said the second man, dismounting with the stiff movements of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the saddle. "I'm Attorney Jameson. There are questions about ownership of this property and everything on it." Eli felt his shoulders tense. These animals were abandoned, left to starve. "That may be true," Jameson said carefully, "but abandonment is a legal concept with specific requirements. Simply leaving animals unattended doesn't necessarily void ownership claims." Mrs. Morrison shot the lawyer a sharp look. What my colleague is trying to say is that there are people in town who've heard about your rescue operation. Most of them are pleased that someone showed mercy to these creatures, but there's at least one man who's expressed interest in claiming them. On what grounds? Cornelius Blackwood owns considerable land in this area, Mrs. Morrison said. He's been buying up abandoned properties, including mining claims. If he can prove ownership of this site, then everything on it becomes his, Jameson finished, including livestock, equipment, and improvements. Eli looked down at Grace, who had settled at his feet like a large dog. Hope was investigating the newcomer's horses with friendly curiosity, clearly hoping for treats. "These girls aren't livestock," he said quietly. "They're living creatures who were dying when I found them. Whatever legal claim someone might have, it doesn't outweigh the moral obligation to show mercy." Mrs. Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. My husband and I have been fighting Blackwood's land grab for months. The man has no appreciation for anything that can't be turned into profit. What are you suggesting?" "Come to town," she said. "Let people see these animals. See what you've done for them. Public opinion still counts for something, even in legal matters. And if Blackwood wants a fight, he'll find Cedar Falls isn't as defenseless as he thinks." Eli looked at Grace and Hope, both of them depending on him for their very lives. 3 days ago, he would have saddled up and ridden away from this kind of trouble. But 3 days ago, he'd been a different man. "How far to Cedar Falls?" he asked. The journey to Cedar Falls took most of the morning, with frequent stops to let Grace and Hope rest. They were stronger than they'd been a week ago, but still far from full health. Eli walked beside them, Old Blue's reins in his hand, watching for any sign that the travel was too much for the recovering Jennies. Mrs. Morrison proved to be excellent company, riding alongside Eli and sharing the history of the region. Her husband, Dr. Port. Morrison, as it turned out, was the town's physician, as well as a council member. Attorney Jameson seemed nervous about the whole enterprise, constantly checking his pocket watch and muttering about proper procedures. "Don't mind him," Mrs. Morrison said with a wry smile. "Harold's a good man, but he sees the world through law books. Some situations require a more direct approach." Cedar Falls was larger than Eli had expected, perhaps 200 souls, with a main street lined with substantial buildings and side roads branching off toward residential areas. It had the feeling of a community that took pride in itself, with painted storefronts and boardwalks swept clean of debris. Their arrival caused something of a sensation. Word had clearly spread about the rescued donkeys, because people emerged from shops and houses to watch the small procession move down Main Street. Eli felt uncomfortable under the scrutiny, but Grace and Hope seemed to enjoy the attention. Hope particularly preening when children called out admiring comments. Dr. Morrison led them to a small paddock behind his house, where fresh hay and clean water waited. As the Jennies settled in to eat their first proper meal in weeks, a crowd gathered at the fence. "Merciful heavens," breathed an elderly woman in a worn but clean dress. "Look how thin they are. How could anyone leave them like that?" "That's what I'd like to know," said a younger man with calloused hands and the look of someone who worked with animals. "I'm Pete Carver, Mr. Thatcher. Run the livery stable here. These girls have been well handled. You can see it in how they trust people. Whoever left them at that mining camp knew they'd die without care. The question," said a new voice from the back of the crowd, "is who has the right to dispose of them now?" The speaker was a tall man in an expensive suit, his dark hair pomaded and his boots polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him spoke of money and the confidence that money brings. Eli didn't need an introduction to know this was Cornelius Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Morrison said coolly, "I wasn't aware you had business with us today." "My business is protecting property rights," Blackwood replied, pushing through the crowd to stand at the fence. His pale eyes assessed the Jennies like he was calculating their market value. "If these animals were left on land I own, they belong to me. And do you own the Broken Creek property?" Attorney Jameson asked, pulling a leather portfolio from his saddlebags. I'm in the process of acquiring it, Blackwood said. The previous owner defaulted on his debts to my bank. Standard foreclosure proceedings. Which haven't been completed, Mrs. Morrison pointed out. Until the paperwork is filed and recorded, that land belongs to no one. A technicality. The law is made of technicalities, Jameson said, surprising everyone with his firmness. Until you can produce a deed, you have no more claim to these animals than anyone else. Eli had been quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward. Seems to me the only claim that matters is moral. These jennies were dying when I found them. I nursed them back to health. That creates a bond that's stronger than any paper deed. Blackwood's laugh was cold. Sentiment is a luxury in this country, Mr. Thatcher. These mountains don't care about your feelings, and neither do I. Those animals represent property value, work animals that can earn their keep or meat, that can feed a family through winter. Grace looked up from her hay at the harsh tone, her ears flicking nervously. Hope moved closer to Eli, pressing against his side in a gesture that had become familiar. They're not property, Eli said quietly. They're living creatures who've suffered enough. Everything's property to someone, Blackwood replied. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be. Dr. Morrison stepped between them. That's enough. These animals are recovering from severe neglect, and they don't need the stress of argument. Mr. Blackwood, you're welcome to pursue your legal remedies through proper channels. Until then, I suggest you leave them in peace. Oh, I'll pursue my remedies, Blackwood said, his pale eyes fixed on Eli. Count on it. After Blackwood left, taking some of the crowd's energy with him, Dr. Morrison invited Eli into his house for coffee and a proper meal. The warmth of the kitchen, with its checked tablecloth and smell of baking bread, reminded Eli painfully of his old life with Sarah. Harold showed me the documents, Dr. Morrison said, settling into a chair across from Eli. The situation isn't hopeless, but it's complicated. The mining company did default on their loans, but the foreclosure process is tied up in territorial court. Could take months to resolve. And in the meantime, you're the only one actually caring for those animals. That should count for something. Mrs. Morrison brought them coffee and thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. There's something else you should know, she said. We found the original deed to the Broken Creek property in the courthouse records. Very interesting reading. She produced a yellowed document from her reticule, unfolding it carefully on the table. The handwriting was formal and precise, dated 15 years earlier. The land was originally a homestead claim, she explained, filed by a man named Joshua Creek, hence the name of the mining camp. He proved up the claim, got full title, then sold it to the mining company 5 years later. Eli studied the document, his eyes catching on one particular section. It says here the sale excluded certain improvements and livestock. Exactly. Creek kept ownership of the buildings he'd constructed and any animals on the property. When he sold to the mining company, he was selling mineral rights, not everything on the land. What happened to Creek? Dr. Morrison leaned forward. That's where it gets interesting. Joshua Creek died 2 years ago, intestate, no will. His estate went into probate, and according to territorial law, unclaimed property reverts to territorial administration, which means the buildings and any livestock that came with the original homestead may not belong to anyone at all. They're essentially orphaned property, waiting for someone to file a proper claim. Attorney Jameson, who had been silent during the meal, finally spoke up. There's precedent for adverse possession in cases like this. If you can demonstrate continuous occupation and improvement of the property, you might be able to file a claim yourself. Eli felt his heart skip. You're saying I could own the land? It's possible. Complicated, but possible. You'd need to establish that you're not just camping there temporarily, but actually settling and improving the property. Building permanent structures, maintaining it, that sort of thing. And the jennies? Mrs. Morrison smiled. Livestock that's been abandoned and then rescued often becomes the property of whoever saved them. especially if the original owner can't be located or has forfeited their rights through neglect. For the first time in 3 years, Eli Thatcher felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Not just hope for tomorrow, but hope for a future, a real future, with roots and purpose and responsibility. "There's one more thing, Doctor," Morrison said quietly. Joshua Creek kept detailed records. According to his notes, he originally brought 4 donkeys to the homestead, a breeding pair and their 2 offspring. Eli looked up sharply. "4? I only found 2. The other 2 probably didn't survive the abandonment. Grace and Hope, as you've named them, they're likely the offspring, which means they were born on that land, making their claim to it even stronger than we thought." Outside, Eli could hear the jennies moving around in their temporary paddock, Hope's distinctive bray carrying across the afternoon air. They were calling for him, he realized, looking for the human who'd become their protector and provider. "What would I need to do?" he asked. "To file a claim, I mean." "Prove continuous occupation for 6 months," Jameson said. "Make substantial improvements to the property, document everything carefully, and hope that Blackwood doesn't find a way to complicate the process." Dr. Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the jennies. "The way I see it, Mr. Thatcher, you've got 2 choices. You can saddle up and ride away from this trouble, leave Grace and Hope to whatever fate awaits them, or you can stay and fight for what's right." Eli thought about the wooden horse now resting in Grace's bedding, about the tears he'd shed over 2 starving animals, about the way Hope pressed against his side when she sensed his sadness. He thought about Sarah's voice telling Thomas that his daddy could make anything with his hands, and about the man he'd been before. Grief hollowed him out. "I'll stay," he said simply. "Whatever it takes, I'll stay and fight." The return journey to Broken Creek felt different than the morning's trip to town. Eli rode with purpose now, his mind already working through the improvements he'd need to make to establish a legal claim. Grace and Hope seemed to sense his changed mood. Hope practically pranced, despite her still fragile condition, while Grace walked with the steady determination of someone heading home. Pete Carver had insisted on accompanying them, bringing along a pack mule loaded with supplies donated by the townspeople. "Folks feel strongly about this," he'd explained while loading sacks of grain and bundles of hay. "Blackwood's been throwing his weight around for months, buying up properties and pushing out families who've been here for years. Some of us think it's time someone stood up to him." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountain valley as they crested the ridge above the mining camp. From this vantage point, Eli could see the property with new eyes, not just a collection of abandoned buildings, but potential. Good water, sheltered valleys for grazing, timber for construction. Joshua Creek had chosen well when he'd filed his homestead claim. "You know," Pete said, following Eli's gaze, "this could be a fine little ranch with some work. Good grass in those meadows come spring, and the creek runs year-round." Creek was making a good start before he got gold fever and sold to the mining company. They made camp in the bunkhouse as the sun set, the jennies settling into what had become their routine. Grace arranged herself close to Eli's bedroll, while Hope investigated every corner of their shelter, checking to make sure everything was as she'd left it. "You girls know this is home now, don't you?" Eli said, scratching behind Hope's ears. "Not just a place to rest before moving on. Actual home." That evening, as they sat around a small fire, Pete shared more of the region's history. "Blackwood showed up about 2 years ago," he said. "Came from back east with money and big plans, started buying land, talking about bringing in industry, railroad connections. Some folks thought it sounded promising. But Blackwood's version of progress seems to involve pushing out anyone who can't afford to fight him in court. Widows, small ranchers, folks who've been here since before the territory was organized. He's got lawyers and politicians in his pocket, makes it hard for regular people to stand against him." Eli poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the clear night sky. "What's his interest in this particular property?" "Water rights, mostly. The creek here feeds into the main river valley, where he's got his biggest holdings. Control the headwaters. Control everything downstream. Plus, there's talk he wants to build a spur line for the railroad. This would be right in the path. So it's not really about Grace and Hope. Those girls are just the excuse he needs to establish his claim. Once he owns this property, he can do whatever he wants with it. That night, Eli lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the Jennies sleeping nearby. Grace's soft breathing, Hope's occasional snort and shift of position, the whisper of wind through the broken boards of the bunkhouse. It all felt like home, in a way no place had since he'd lost Sarah and Thomas. But with that sense of belonging came responsibility, not just to Grace and Hope, but to the memory of Joshua Creek, who'd built something good here before gold fever destroyed his dreams. To the townspeople who'd shown kindness to a stranger, even to the idea that sometimes right was more important than legal technicalities. The next morning brought the first real test of Eli's resolve. He woke to find fresh horse tracks around the camp, several riders who'd circled the buildings during the night, close enough to observe but staying just out of sight. Old Blue was nervous, ears pricked toward every sound, and even the Jennies seemed unsettled. "Blackwood's men," Pete said grimly, studying the tracks. "Probably checking to see if you're really settling in or just passing through." "Let them look," Eli replied, but his hand instinctively checked the Colt at his hip. "We've got work to do." And work they did. With Pete's help, Eli began the process of transforming the abandoned mining camp into something resembling a functional homestead. They patched the worst holes in the bunkhouse roof, cleared debris from around the spring, and began planning a proper shelter for the Jennies. It was while moving rocks to create a foundation for a small barn that Eli found something that stopped him cold. Buried under a pile of mining equipment was a faded tintype photograph in a cracked frame, a family portrait of a man, woman, and two small children, standing proudly in front of a half-built cabin. "That's Creek's family," Pete said, looking over Eli's shoulder. "Lost his wife and both children to scarlet fever the winter before he sold to the mining company. Heard he never got over it." Eli stared at the photograph, seeing his own story reflected in the faces of long-dead strangers. A man who'd built something good, lost everything that mattered, and finally given up hope. The mining venture had probably been Creek's way of running from grief, just as drifting had been Eli's. What happened to him in the end? Died alone in a boarding house in Cheyenne. Drinking, mostly. Had nothing left by then. The mining company had failed. His land was tied up in legal disputes. His family was gone. Just another broken man in a territory full of them. That evening, Eli sat with the photograph propped against his knee, Grace curled beside him, and Hope dozing nearby. The parallels between his story and Creek's were uncomfortable. Two men who'd lost their families, abandoned their homes, tried to escape their pain by running toward something else. But there was one crucial difference. Creek had been alone when grief finally broke him. Eli had Grace and Hope, two living creatures who depended on him for their very survival. That dependence had become his anchor, the thing that made tomorrow matter more than yesterday. "I won't let it end the same way," he said aloud, his words carrying across the quiet camp. "Whatever Blackwood tries, whatever the law says, whatever it costs, I won't abandon you girls the way everyone else has." Hope raised her head at the sound of his voice, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Grace stirred against his side, making the soft rumbling sound that meant contentment. For the first time since Sarah's death, Eli Thatcher felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The knowledge that someone wanted to take it all away only made him more determined to hold on to what he'd found. In the distance, a coyote howled wild and lonesome. But around the small fire, three souls who'd found each other settled in for another night of safety and mutual protection, ready to face whatever morning might bring. Pete left after 3 days, promising to return the following week with more supplies and news from town. Alone again with Grace and Hope, Eli fell into a rhythm of work and routine that felt surprisingly natural. Dawn meant feeding the jennies and checking on their health. Morning was for construction, slowly but steadily, improving the bunkhouse and beginning work on a proper barn. Afternoons were for exploring the property, learning its boundaries and resources. Evenings belonged to quiet conversation with his four-legged companions and the strange peace of belonging somewhere again. It was during one of these solitary evenings, 2 weeks after Pete's departure, that Eli made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been sorting through his saddlebags, looking for needle and thread to mend a torn shirt, when his fingers found something he'd forgotten. Was there a letter, sealed and yellowed with age, bearing Sarah's careful handwriting. His heart nearly stopped. He'd carried Sarah's ring for 3 years, but a letter? How had he not known it was there? With trembling hands, he turned the envelope over. Across the back, in Sarah's familiar script, "For my beloved Eli, when you're ready to remember love instead of loss." Grace sensed his distress and moved closer, pressing her warm bulk against his side. Hope looked up from her evening grazing, ears pricked with concern. Even in their simple animal way, they understood that their protector was in pain. Eli stared at the envelope for a long time before finally breaking the seal. Inside, 2 pages of Sarah's careful handwriting, dated just days before her death. "My dearest Eli, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've finally found the courage to remember our love instead of drowning in guilt over my death. I pray it hasn't taken too long. You always were too hard on yourself, my stubborn cowboy. I know what you're thinking, that you should have been here, that if you'd come home sooner or never left at all, you could have saved us. I know because you told me that very thing 100 times during my last week, and I told you 100 times that you were wrong. The cattle drive was necessary, we both knew that. The money you earned kept our ranch afloat for another year, gave us hope for the future. Thomas and I were proud of you for taking on that responsibility, proud that other men trusted you to lead them. We knew you'd come home to us when the job was done, and we knew we'd be waiting. Sickness is nobody's fault, my love. Not yours, not mine, not God's. It simply is. What matters is not that we died, but that we lived. What matters is not that you weren't here at the end, but that you gave us 8 beautiful years of life together. Do you remember our first winter in the cabin? How the roof leaked and the chimney smoked, and we had to huddle together under every quilt we owned just to stay warm? You said it was no fit place for a lady, and I told you that any place with you was exactly where I belonged. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Thomas's last words were about you. "Tell Papa I wasn't scared," he said. "Tell him the horse he carved is helping me be brave." He died holding that little wooden toy, Eli, and there was no fear in his eyes, only love. I need you to understand something, and I need you to carry it with you always. Loving us was not a mistake, even though it ended in grief. The joy we shared, the life we built, the family we created, none of that is diminished by death. It lives on in you, in your memories, in your capacity to love again. Because you will love again, my darling. Not the same way our love was unique and irreplaceable, but your heart is too big and too good to remain closed forever. When the time comes, when you meet someone or something that needs your protection and care, don't turn away. Don't think that loving again means forgetting us. I want you to build a new life, Eli. I want you to find purpose and joy and companionship. I want you to use those skilled hands to create something beautiful, to protect something vulnerable, to matter in the world again. Thomas and I will always be part of that life, but we shouldn't be all of it. Look for us in the sunrise over new pastures. Hear our voices in the laughter of children and the gentle sounds of animals in your care. Feel our love in the warmth of a good fire and the satisfaction of honest work. We're not gone, my beloved. We're just changed, woven into the fabric of who you are and who you'll become. Be happy, Eli. That's not a request, it's a commandment from your wife, who loves you more than words can say. Be happy, be useful, be kind. Love something again, even if it's just a broken-down old horse or a stray dog that needs a home. Let your heart heal, and then use it. Forever yours, Sarah. P.S. The wooden horse you carved for Thomas is in your saddlebags. He would want you to give it to some child who needs to know that brave cowboys never really go away. Eli read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Grace had settled completely against his side now, her breathing slow and steady. Hope had wandered over and was resting her chin on his knee, brown eyes full of patient concern. She knew, he whispered to them. Sarah knew exactly what would happen to me, and she tried to leave me a way back. The guilt that had been his constant companion for 3 years didn't disappear. That would take more time. But it began to transform, shifting from a weight that held him down to something more like gratitude. Sarah had loved him enough to worry about his future, had spent her last days trying to build him a bridge back to living. And here he was, caring for 2 abandoned creatures who needed his protection, building something with his hands, mattering in the world again. Everything Sarah had wanted for him, he was already doing. The horse, he said suddenly, remembering her postscript. Grace's wooden toy, Thomas's wooden toy, was exactly where Sarah said it would be. But now it had found its purpose, bringing comfort to a creature who'd known abandonment and fear. Reckon Thomas would approve, Eli murmured, scratching behind Grace's ears. Always did want pets. But even as peace settled over him like a warm blanket, Eli knew his trials weren't over. The letter had given him absolution for the past, but the future still held challenges. Blackwood hadn't given up. The occasional horse tracks around the property proved that, and winter was coming, bringing its own tests of survival and resolve. Tomorrow would bring new struggles, new threats to the life he was building. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Eli Thatcher felt like the man Sarah had married, capable of love, worthy of happiness, strong enough to protect what mattered. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his saddlebags, but kept its message close to his heart. Sarah's final gift hadn't been guilt or obligation, but permission to live again, to love again, to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. "Thank you," he whispered to the Wyoming wind, trusting it would carry his words to wherever Sarah and Thomas waited. "Thank you for showing me the way home." The confrontation Eli had been expecting came on a bitter December morning, 2 weeks after he'd found Sarah's letter. He was working on the roof of the new barn, Grace and Hope grazing peacefully in the meadow below, when the sound of approaching horses broke the mountain stillness. 8 riders crested the ridge, moving with the purposeful pace of men on serious business. Even at a distance, Eli recognized Cornelius Blackwood's expensive coat and the hard faces of the hired men who flanked him. They'd come in force this time, and their intention was clear. Eli climbed down from the roof slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, but his right hand stayed close to the colt at his hip, and his eyes never left the approaching riders. Grace and Hope sensed the tension immediately, abandoning their grazing to move closer to the barn, where Eli stood waiting. "Mr. Thatcher," Blackwood called as he reined in his horse 20 feet away, "I believe we have business to conclude." "Don't recall any business between us," Eli replied calmly. Blackwood pulled a folded document from his coat and held it up. "This says different. Deed to this property, properly recorded as of yesterday. Everything on these 300 acres now belongs to me, buildings, improvements, livestock, and trespassers. Let me see it." One of Blackwood's men started to protest, but Blackwood waved him silent and rode closer, extending the deed. Eli read it carefully, his heart sinking with each line. It looked legitimate, all the proper seals and signatures, dated and recorded through the territorial court system. "Joshua Creek never had clear title to this land," Blackwood explained with satisfaction. "His original homestead claim was filed improperly, never properly proved up. The territorial government sold the land at auction 6 months ago to satisfy outstanding debts. I was the winning bidder, Funny how you're just now getting around to telling me this. I've been generous, allowing you to squat here while the paperwork was processed. But patience has its limits. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and leave. The animals stay, they're part of the property now. Grace pressed against Eli's leg, as if sensing that her world was about to change again. Hope stood alert but calm, trusting in the human who'd saved her life. Neither animal understood the legal complexities that threatened to separate them from their protector. "These jennies were abandoned," Eli said. "Left to die. I saved their lives. And I'm sure they're grateful, but gratitude doesn't change ownership." Blackwood's pale eyes glittered with cold amusement. "You can visit them if you like, once I've put them back to useful work." The threat was clear. Whatever Blackwood had planned for Grace and Hope, it wouldn't involve the gentle care they'd received from Eli. They'd become work animals again, valued only for their labor, discarded when they were no longer profitable. "What kind of useful work?" Eli asked. "There's a mine opening up north of here. These animals are perfect for hauling ore carts, strong backs, sure feet, bred for hard work in difficult terrain. My foreman tells me they'll bring good money." Eli's blood ran cold. He'd seen mine donkeys before, worked to exhaustion in dark tunnels, breathing rock dust and poisonous gases, lasting maybe 2 years before they collapsed and died. It was a death sentence, disguised as employment. "They're not strong enough for mine work. They're still recovering from starvation." "They look healthy enough to me," Blackwood said dismissively. "Good feed and regular work will toughen them up quick enough." Behind Blackwood, his men had spread out in a loose semicircle, hands resting casually on their weapons. They weren't taking any chances on Eli's cooperation. One man held a rope halter, clearly intended for leading away the jennies. "I need more time," Eli said, "to gather my things, say goodbye. You have 1 hour. My men will wait here to make sure you don't try anything foolish." Blackwood rode back to join his hired guns, leaving Eli alone with Grace and Hope. The jennies seemed to understand that something was wrong, staying close to his side and watching the strangers with nervous eyes. Eli's mind raced through options, none of them good. He could try to fight 1 man against 8 was suicidal, but at least Grace and Hope wouldn't end up in the mines. He could try to run, loading the jennies onto Old Blue and making for the territorial border. But they'd never outrun mounted pursuit, and winter travel would be brutal for animals still regaining their strength. Or he could surrender, let Blackwood take the jennies, and hope that somehow justice would prevail through legal channels. But justice took time, and Grace and Hope didn't have time. Inside the bunkhouse, Eli's hands moved automatically, packing his few possessions while his mind worked through possibilities. His fingers found the familiar weight of his father's Winchester, the rifle that had fed his family and protected his home during his ranching days. It was a fine weapon, accurate and reliable, crafted by a man who understood that sometimes force was the only language bullies understood. He thought about his father, then a quiet man who'd taught Eli that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were against you. "Son," his father had said once, "a man who won't stand up for what's right isn't much of a man at all." Grace appeared in the doorway, having followed him inside. She pressed her muzzle against his hand, seeking the comfort that had become second nature between them. Her trust was absolute. Unquestioning, she believed in him completely, had no doubt that he would protect her from whatever threatened their small family. "I know, girl," Eli whispered. "I know what I have to do." He checked the rifle's action, making sure it was clean and ready. 6 shells in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Not enough to win a war, but maybe enough to make his point. Outside, he could hear Blackwood's men talking in low voices, probably discussing how to handle any resistance from the crazy cowboy who'd gotten too attached to a pair of donkeys. They couldn't understand what Grace and Hope meant to him. These weren't just animals he'd rescued. They were his redemption, his path back to the man Sarah had loved, his proof that love was stronger than loss. They were Thomas's wooden horse brought to life, Sarah's final gift wrapped in brown fur and stubborn courage. 20 minutes left of his hour. Time enough to make his choice, to decide what kind of man he wanted to be in the face of injustice. The old Eli might have walked away, shoulders bent with defeat, convinced that fighting was useless. But the old Eli had been broken by grief, hollowed out by guilt, drifting through life without purpose or hope. This Eli, the man who'd carved feeding bowls with his own hands, who'd slept with his arms around a dying donkey, who'd found love again in the simple trust of innocent creatures, this Eli was different. This Eli was worth fighting for. He stepped outside, Winchester in his hands, and faced the men who wanted to take away everything that mattered. Grace and hope flanked him like soldiers, ready to follow their protector wherever the battle might lead. "Gentlemen," Eli called to Blackwood and his hired guns, "we need to renegotiate the terms of this conversation." The sight of Eli emerging from the bunkhouse with the Winchester caused an immediate stir among Blackwood's men. Hands moved to holsters, rifles were shifted from saddle sheaths to ready positions, and horses danced nervously as their riders prepared for trouble. "Now, Mr. Thatcher," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, "there's no need for dramatics. You're outnumbered 8-1. Be sensible. Being sensible is what got these girls left to die in the first place," Eli replied, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Sometimes a man has to do what's right instead of what's smart." Grace had positioned herself between Eli and the nearest rider, her ears pinned back in a display of protective aggression that surprised everyone, including Eli. Hope stood at his other side, her usual playful demeanor replaced by alert watchfulness. The Jennies might not understand legal documents, but they recognized a threat to their family. "You're willing to die for a pair of donkeys?" one of Blackwood's men asked, his tone suggesting he thought Eli had lost his mind. "I'm willing to live for them," Eli answered. "There's a difference." The standoff stretched taut as wire. 8 armed men on horseback against 1 man on foot with 2 donkeys. The odds couldn't have been worse. But something in Eli's stance, in the steady way he held his rifle, in the absolute calm of his voice, made Blackwood's men hesitate. This wasn't some desperate drifter making a last foolish stand. This was a man who'd found something worth protecting and had made peace with whatever that protection might cost. "Stand down, Thatcher," Blackwood ordered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "I have legal claim to this property and everything on it. You're interfering with lawful business." "Your papers might be legal," Eli said, "but that doesn't make them right. These animals trust me to protect them. I won't betray that trust." "Then you're a fool." "Maybe. But I'm a fool with good aim and nothing left to lose." The Mexican standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the sound of approaching horses changed everything. From the valley below came the thunder of hoofbeats, many horses, moving fast. Blackwood's men turned in their saddles, suddenly uncertain whether they were still the ones in control. Sheriff Tom Bradley crested the ridge first, followed by Pete Carver and half a dozen other men from Cedar Falls. But it was the figure riding beside the sheriff that made Eli's heart leap. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, her face set with grim determination. "What's all this about, Cornelius?" Sheriff Bradley called as he reined in his horse. He was a man in his 60s, weathered and practical, who'd kept the peace in this territory for 20 years by treating all citizens fairly. "Official business, Sheriff," Blackwood replied, but his confident tone had wavered. "I'm taking possession of property that legally belongs to me." "That's so." Bradley dismounted and walked over to examine Blackwood's deed. "Mind if I take a look at your paperwork?" While the sheriff studied the document, Mrs. Morrison rode closer to Eli. "We found something interesting in the courthouse records," she said quietly. "Harold's been working day and night to trace the ownership of this land. What did you find?" "Joshua Creek's original homestead filing. Turns out it was properly completed after all. The clerk just misfiled the final papers. Creek held clear title right up until he died." Eli felt a surge of hope. "What does that mean?" It means Creek's estate was never properly probated. When someone dies intestate with clear property title, the law requires public notice and a waiting period before any sale can be completed. That never happened. Sheriff Bradley handed Blackwood's deed back to him, his face carefully neutral. This is interesting reading, Cornelius. According to this, the territory sold Creek's land at auction 6 months ago. That's right, all properly done through the court system. Except the territory didn't own Creek's land to sell. Mrs. Morrison interjected, producing her own set of documents. Joshua Creek held clear title at the time of his death. His estate should have gone through proper probate proceedings. Attorney Jameson, who had ridden in with the Cedar Falls contingent, cleared his throat nervously. The law is quite specific about this. Property cannot be sold by the territory unless ownership has been legally established through probate court. Any sale without proper title verification is void. Blackwood's face had gone pale, but he wasn't finished fighting. Clerical errors, technical issues that can be resolved through the courts. It doesn't change the basic facts. This man is trespassing on land I purchased in good faith. Actually, said a new voice, it changes everything. The speaker was a young man in a city suit, riding a rented horse with the awkward seat of someone unused to the saddle. He dismounted carefully and walked over to join the group around Sheriff Bradley. Jonathan Creek, he introduced himself. Joshua Creek was my uncle. I'm his heir and legal next of kin. Blackwood stared at him as if he'd seen a ghost. That's impossible. Creek had no living family. Uncle Joshua thought that was true, Jonathan replied calmly. We'd been estranged for years over his decision to leave civilization for frontier life, but family is family. When I learned of his death and the questions about his estate, I came west to settle matters. He handed Sheriff Bradley a packet of legal documents, properly filed probate petition, proof of relationship, and a clear inheritance claim. As Joshua Creek's legal heir, I now own this property. The silence that followed was deafening. Blackwood's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, suddenly aware that their simple eviction had become a complex legal dispute. Grace and Hope, sensing the change in atmosphere, relaxed slightly, but remained close to Eli's sides. This is preposterous, Blackwood sputtered. You can't just appear out of nowhere and claim ownership based on alleged family ties. The documentation is quite thorough, Attorney Jameson said, examining Jonathan's papers. Birth certificates, family records, correspondence between the Creek brothers dating back 15 years. It appears legitimate. Sheriff Bradley nodded slowly. Well, Cornelius, looks like your deed might not be worth the paper it's printed on. Can't sell what you don't own, and if the territory never had clear title. This is a conspiracy, Blackwood declared, his composure finally cracking. A coordinated effort to defraud me of my lawful property. I'll contest this in court, and I'll win. Jonathan Creek smiled for the first time since arriving. You're welcome to try, Mr. Blackwood, but I should mention that I'm a lawyer myself, recently graduated from Harvard Law. I've spent the last 3 months researching territorial property law in preparation for this case. Eli watched this exchange with growing amazement. An hour ago, he'd been preparing to fight 8 armed men for the right to protect Grace and Hope. Now, through an almost miraculous turn of events, their future seemed secure. What about the donkeys? He asked Jonathan. Your uncle's animals? Ah, yes. The famous rescued jennies, Jonathan said, turning his attention to Grace and Hope. I've heard quite a story about their salvation. Uncle Joshua always loved animals, had quite a menagerie on his farm back in Ohio before he came west. He approached Grace slowly, extending his hand for her to sniff. She investigated him curiously but without fear, her instincts telling her this human meant no harm. From what I understand, Jonathan continued, you've invested considerable time and resources in caring for these animals. Nursed them back to health, provided shelter, given them names and affection. Uncle Joshua would have approved. They're good girls, Eli said simply, deserve better than they got. Indeed they do. Which brings me to a proposal, Mr. Thatcher. I came west to settle Uncle Joshua's estate, but I have no intention of staying. My life and career are back east. I need someone to manage this property, someone who understands the land and cares about it." Eli felt his heart skip. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a partnership. You continue caring for the property and the animals, make whatever improvements you see fit, run it as you think best. In exchange, you get half ownership and full management authority. When I die, your half becomes full ownership." The offer was so generous, so unexpected, that Eli could barely process it. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because you're not a stranger," Jonathan replied. "Uncle Joshua wrote about you in his final letters, the cowboy who saved his donkeys when no one else would. He said you were the kind of man who deserved a second chance. Joshua wrote about me, but we never met." Jonathan reached into his coat and pulled out a worn envelope. This was found among his papers. He never sent it, but he wrote it just days before he died. With shaking hands, Eli took the letter and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "To the man who saved my girls. If you're reading this, it means you found grace and hope and showed them the mercy I couldn't. I've been watching from town, seeing how you care for them, how they trust you. I know I should introduce myself, explain why I left them, but I'm ashamed. I loved those donkeys like children, but when the grief got too heavy, I convinced myself someone else would come along, someone stronger than me. I told myself it was kindness to leave them rather than sell them to men who'd work them to death. But it was cowardice, plain and simple. You gave them what I couldn't hope. That's why I named them what I did. Grace for the smaller one who never gave up faith in human kindness. Hope for the larger one who always believed tomorrow would be better. I don't deserve forgiveness, but they do deserve love. Thank you for giving them both." Eli wiped his eyes, not caring who saw his tears. Even in death, broken men were reaching across time to offer him redemption, to show him that love could triumph over loss. Blackwood wasn't finished. Even as the legal tide turned against him, his face darkened with rage and desperation. He'd invested too much time and money in acquiring this property to walk away quietly. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But I'm not leaving empty-handed. I have contracts to fulfill, debts secured by this property. If I can't claim the land, I'll take what I can." Before anyone could react, Blackwood spurred his horse forward, charging directly at Grace and Hope. His intention was clear. If he couldn't own the Jennies, he'd scatter them, possibly injure them, create enough chaos to escape with something. But Blackwood had miscalculated. Grace, despite her gentle nature, was still a donkey, an animal bred for thousands of years to be stubborn, protective, and surprisingly fierce when threatened. As Blackwood's horse bore down on her, Grace planted her feet and let out a bray that shook the mountain air. Then she charged. Blackwood's expensive horse, bred for show rather than work, panicked at the sight of an angry donkey running straight at him. The animal reared, unseating Blackwood and sending him tumbling to the ground in an undignified heap. Grace skidded to a stop, just short of trampling him, standing over the fallen man, with her ears pinned back and her teeth bared. Hope, not to be outdone by her companion, positioned herself between Blackwood's men and Eli, her own ears flattened in warning. The message was clear. Anyone who threatened their protector would have to go through both Jennies first. "I'll be damned," Pete Carver said with admiration. "Those girls know who their family is." Sheriff Bradley dismounted and helped the dazed Blackwood to his feet. "Cornelius, I think it's time you and your men headed back to town. This matter is settled." "This isn't over," Blackwood snarled, brushing dirt from his expensive coat. "I'll contest the inheritance, challenge the probate, file appeals." "You do that," Jonathan Creek said calmly. "I'll be happy to meet you in court. But I should warn you, attempting to steal livestock is a felony in this territory. So is fraudulent sale of property you don't own." The threat was delivered quietly, but it carried the weight of legal knowledge behind it. Blackwood's face went pale as he realized his position had shifted from prosecutor to defendant. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward. "Cornelius, I'm giving you and your men 10 minutes to clear this property. If I see you here again without proper legal authority, I'll arrest you for trespassing and harassment." "Mrs. Morrison added, "Don't think the good people of Cedar Falls haven't noticed your methods, Blackwood. Bullying widows and threatening honest men doesn't make you popular in these parts." Blackwood looked around the circle of faces, all hostile, all united against him. For a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and legal maneuvering, this united front was a new and unwelcome experience. "This land should have been mine," he said bitterly. "I had plans, vision for development. What will you do with it? Let it sit empty while you play house with a pair of worthless animals." "Those animals aren't worthless," Eli said quietly. "They saved my life just as much as I saved theirs, and this land won't sit empty. It'll be a home again, the way Joshua Creek intended." Jonathan nodded in agreement. Uncle Joshua would have liked that. He always said the land should be worked by people who loved it, not exploited by those who saw only profit. Defeated, Blackwood mounted his horse with what dignity he could salvage. His men followed suit, their earlier confidence replaced by embarrassment and uncertainty. "You haven't heard the last of me," Blackwood warned as he prepared to leave. "Actually, I think we have," Sheriff Bradley replied. "Word of advice, Cornelius. Next time you want to steal someone's property, make sure you actually own it first." As Blackwood and his men rode away, the tension that had gripped the mountain clearing finally began to dissipate. Grace wandered over to Eli, nuzzling his hand as if checking to make sure he was unharmed. Hope investigated the spot where Blackwood had fallen, sniffing curiously at the disturbed earth. "Well," Jonathan said, watching the Jennies with amusement, "I can see why Uncle Joshua loved them. They certainly know how to take care of their own." "They're family," Eli said simply. "That's what family does." Jonathan smiled, and in that expression, Eli caught a glimpse of the man Joshua Creek might have been if grief hadn't broken him. "Speaking of family, Mr. Thatcher, do we have an agreement? Partnership in this land, shared ownership of everything on it?" Eli looked around the property he'd come to love, the half-built barn, the patched bunkhouse, the clear stream running down from the mountains, the meadows where Grace and Hope could graze safely. All of it could be his now, legally and permanently. But more than that, he could see the future stretching ahead, springs when the meadows would be green with new grass, summers of building and improving, winters of companionship and quiet satisfaction. He could see Grace and Hope growing old and content, maybe even raising foals of their own someday. "We have an agreement," he said, extending his hand to Jonathan. "Partners." As they shook hands, sealing the deal that would transform Eli from a drifter into a landowner, Grace let out a satisfied snort and wandered back to her grazing. Hope followed, already bored with human affairs now that the threat was over. The crisis was past, the future was secure, and the small family that had found each other in the ruins of an abandoned mining camp could finally rest easy. Spring came early to the high country that year, arriving on a warm wind that melted the last stubborn patches of snow and coaxed new grass from the mountain meadows. Eli stood in the doorway of his completed barn, watching Grace and Hope graze in the pasture he'd fenced during the long winter months. Both Jennies had filled out beautifully, their coats glossy with health, their movements confident and strong. Around Hope's neck hung a small brass bell, not for practical purposes, but as a celebration. Jonathan Creek had sent it from Denver along with his spring letter, writing that every creature deserved something beautiful in their life, some small token of joy and hope for the future. The sound of the bell carried across the clear morning air as Hope investigated a patch of wildflowers, her movements creating a gentle music that had become the soundtrack of Eli's new life. Grace was never far away, the two Jennies maintaining the close bond that had probably kept them alive during their darkest days. Eli had named the property Haven Ranch, partly for the shelter it provided, partly for the peace he'd found here among the ruins of other men's dreams. The mining camp was gone now, its broken buildings cleared away to make room for proper ranch structures. The bunkhouse had become his home, expanded and improved until it resembled the cabin he'd once shared with Sarah and Thomas. But this wasn't an attempt to recreate the past. The new cabin held different memories, carried different hopes. Sarah's wedding ring still rested in his vest pocket, but it no longer felt like a weight. Instead, it had become a reminder that love survived even death, that the capacity for caring didn't diminish just because it had been tested by loss. Pete Carver rode up the valley trail, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies from town. He'd become a regular visitor during the winter months, partly for business but mostly for friendship. It had been years since Eli had experienced the easy companionship of another man who understood the rhythm of ranch life. "Morning, Eli," Pete called as he dismounted near the barn. "Brought your mail and some news from town. Good news or bad news?" "Depends on your perspective. Blackwood's gone pulled up stakes last week and headed back east. Seems his legal troubles got too complicated to sort out, and his financial backers lost confidence." Eli felt a mixture of relief and something that might have been pity. Cornelius Blackwood had been a hard man, driven by greed and entitlement, but in the end, he'd been defeated by his own arrogance. There was a lesson in that, for anyone willing to learn it. What about his properties, being sold off to pay his debts? The sheriff thinks most of the small ranchers he forced out will be able to buy back their land at fair prices. Mrs. Morrison is organizing a community effort to help families get back on their feet. Pete helped Eli unload supplies, their conversation drifting over the small news that connected isolated communities, births and deaths, marriages and departures, the endless human drama of people trying to build lives in a harsh but beautiful country. "Oh, and this came for you," Pete said, handing Eli a thick envelope bearing Jonathan Creek's return address. Eli opened it to find legal documents and a letter written in Jonathan's careful script. "Dear partner, I hope this letter finds you and our girls thriving in the spring weather. I've completed the final paperwork for our partnership agreement. You'll find your copy enclosed, properly notarized, and recorded. I have news that I think you'll find interesting. I've been corresponding with a horse breeder in Colorado who specializes in mountain-bred stock. It seems there's growing demand for hardy pack animals, and donkeys are particularly prized for their intelligence and reliability in difficult terrain. Would you be interested in expanding Haven Ranch's operation? I can provide the initial investment for breeding stock, and your knowledge of animal husbandry would be invaluable. Grace and Hope have proven themselves excellent ambassadors for their species. I think they'd make wonderful mothers when the time comes. Consider it, and let me know your thoughts. Either way, I'm proud of what you've built up there. Uncle Joshua would be too. Your friend and partner, Jonathan Creek." Eli smiled as he folded the letter. A breeding operation would mean more animals to care for, more responsibility, more connection to the community of ranchers and traders who moved through the territory. It would mean Haven Ranch becoming a real business, not just a refuge for broken hearts and abandoned creatures. But it would also mean Grace and Hope would have company of their own kind, would experience the natural rhythms of mating and foaling and raising young. They deserved that chance at a complete life. He looked out at the Jennies, both of them now approaching the barn with the casual confidence of animals who knew they were loved and protected. Grace still carried Thomas's wooden horse in her bedding, though she no longer seemed to need it for comfort. Hope still pressed her warm bulk against his side on cold mornings, offering and receiving affection in equal measure. "What do you think, ladies?" Eli asked as they gathered around him, hoping for treats. "Ready to be mothers someday?" Hope wickered and nudged his pocket where he kept the dried apples that served as special treats. Grace was more reserved, as always, but her dark eyes held the contentment of a creature who had found her place in the world. That evening, as the sun set behind the western peaks and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Eli sat on his porch with Grace and Hope, flanked beside him like faithful dogs. The brass bell on Hope's collar chimed softly in the evening breeze, a sound that would forever remind him of this moment, this perfect balance of memory and hope, loss and love, ending and beginning. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonesome song to the emerging stars. But around the warm circle of lamplight that spilled from Haven Ranch, a man and two donkeys settled into another evening of mutual companionship, grateful for the second chances that had brought them together. Eli pulled out paper and pen to write his response to Jonathan's proposal. There were plans to make, dreams to consider, futures to build. But first, he took a moment to simply appreciate what he already had: a home, a purpose, and the quiet knowledge that love, once given freely, always found a way to multiply. In his vest pocket, Sarah's ring caught the lamplight like a small star. In Grace's bedding, Thomas's wooden horse stood sentinel over the peace they'd all found together. And in the brass bell around Hope's neck, the future chimed its gentle promise of good things yet to come. The story that had begun with tears of grief had transformed into something infinitely more precious: tears of joy, gratitude, and the peculiar contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. Outside Haven Ranch, the Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under its canopy of stars, wild and beautiful and full of possibility. But inside the small circle of warmth and companionship that Eli Thatcher had built from the ruins of other men's dreams, all was well. All was home.